Well, good afternoon, everybody. I want to say, first of all, how bummed we all are that we are not going to be able to celebrate tonight at our Rock Shabbat. As you can see behind me, I've got the backdrop that was going to be in the sanctuary. I got brand new groggers for everybody. I had some wonderful songs that we were going to sing together, some Tom Petty, some Creedence Clearwater. All kinds of great stuff. So what a bummer. But in the ideas of pikuach nefesh, of preserving a life, I think that it is worth the risk. So instead, this afternoon, I thought I'd teach a little bit about Esther, and then I'd read the Megillah reading to fulfill that commandment for you all to hear the Megillah reading. So I'll read it for you all in English. But first of all, I wanted to teach a little bit about the book of Esther, with thanks to some of our commentaries and things like that, things that you might not know. So the book of Esther, or Megillah Esther, as we call it, this is bound up in our celebration of Purim. So a couple things to mention. Purim is the only biblical festival not mentioned in the Torah. And so it needed a reason or authorization, and this is where it comes from. This story of the book of Esther. It is the centerpiece of the observance of Purim. It is typically read publicly, but today it will be read via live stream, what with things that tradition could not account for, such as pandemics. As I said in our Thursday newsletters and past understandings, Purim is a time really to let go, to release ourselves from the calcified sort of decorum of everything, the observance and rituals. We're supposed to turn everything on its head. We're supposed to be silly. It's carnival-esque. Sometimes in reality, we go to carnivals, we dress up, we poke fun at our own rituals. When reading the book of Esther, we're supposed to cheer when we hear the names of Mordecai and do the grogger or boo when we hear the names of Haman. All the decorum goes out the window. And all of that comes from the idea of the book of Esther, the carnival-esque atmosphere within the book itself, all the things that are reversals and silly and those sorts of things that occur. It's a comedy, the book of Esther. It should be read as a comedy. And the rabbinic midrash seem to have figured that out. There is certainly bawdiness and slapstick humor. There's voyeurism, such as drunken nobles hoping to the queen. Let me put this on Do Not Disturb. Uh-oh. There we go. So I said there is voyeurism, trying to ogle the queen. There are views inside the harem, when girls apply cosmetics for a year in preparation for a night in the king's bed. The lavishness of the Persian court and the 10 drinking banquets add to an aura of comic excess. Misunderstandings between Ahasuerus and Haman, the climax of the plot. These should, as our commentators say, they should produce belly laughs. It is what the JPS Study Bible calls low comedy. The story's plot, it says, is structured on improbabilities, exaggerations, misunderstandings, and reversals. So that is something to keep in mind when we are reading this story, right? It's a comedy. It's supposed to be funny. It's supposed to provide us abilities to let go and release and laugh about things and go from there. So so that we know, it was probably written sometime between 400 and 300 BCE. There is certainly some Persian influence that we should keep in mind. We cannot deny the similarities of the name Mordecai and Esther to the pagan ideas of Marduk and Ishtar. So how this all came together, well, that's its own sort of lesson, its own story, and how it ended up in our canon. It doesn't mention God once. These are all great questions to ask when we are hearing this story. So I thought that I would read for you guys the Megillah Esther so that we can fulfill that commandment. If you are watching, please feel free to cheer during Mordechai and boo or grogger during when we say Haman, or Haman. So here we go. And it happened in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who was king from India to Cush, 127 provinces. In those days when Ahasuerus was seated on his royal throne, which was in Shushan, the capital, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a great banquet in his presence for all his ministers and his servants, the freeholders of Persia and Media, the noblemen of the ministers in the provinces, when he showed the wealth of his kingdom's glory and the worth of the splendor of his greatness, many days, 180 days. And when these days had gone by, the king made a banquet for all the people who are in Shushan, the capital, from the greatest to the least. 7-day banquet in the garden court of the king's pavilion. White linen, indigo, cotton fastened with cords of fine crimson cloth on silver cylinders and marble columns, gold and silver couches on a paving of alabaster and marble, and mother of pearl and black pearl. And drink was proffered in golden vessels and vessels of various kinds, and abundant royal wine in kingly fashion. And the drinking was according to royal rule. There was no compulsion. For thus had the king decreed to all the officials in his house to let every man act according to his will. Vashti, too, made a banquet in the royal house that was Ahasuerus's. On the 7th day, when the king was of good cheer through the wine, he said to Mehuman, Biseta, Hasbona, Bigatha, Agabtha, Zetan, and Carcas, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with the royal crown, to show her beauty to the peoples and the ministers, for she was comely to look at. And Queen Vashti refused to come according to the word of the king by the eunuchs. And the king was very furious, and his rage flared up within him. And the king said to the sages, experts in protocol, for thus was the king's practice before all the experts in rule and law, to those closest to him were Karchena, Shethar, Adamantha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 ministers of Persia and Media, according to the rule, what to do with Queen Vashti, because she had not obeyed the king's dictate by the eunuchs. And Memucan said before the king and the ministers, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but against all the ministers and all the peoples that are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's act will go out to all the women to hold their husbands in contempt in their eyes. And they will say, King Ahasuerus said to bring Vashti before him, and she did not come. And this very day, the noblewomen of Persia and Media will say to all the king's nobles that they heard of the queen's act, and there will be a full measure of contempt and fury. If it please the king, let the royal decree go out from before him and be written into the rules of Persia and Media, not to be transgressed, that Vashti not come in the presence of King Ahasuerus, and her queenship be given to another better than she. And let the king's edict that he will issue be heard throughout his kingdom, large though it is, and let all wives accord worth to their husbands, from the greatest to the least. And the thing was good in the eyes of the king and the ministers, and the king did according to Memucan's word, and he sent out ministers to all the provinces of the king, to every single province in its own writing, and to every single people in its own language, that every man should rule in his home and speak his people's language. End of chapter 1. How are we doing so far? Let's keep going. Chapter 2. After these things, when King Ahasuerus' wrath subsided, he recalled Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed about her. And the king's lads, his servants, said, "Let virgins comely to look be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officials in all the provinces of his kingdom, and every young virgin woman comely to look at be gathered in Shushan at the women's house by Haggai, the king's eunuch, keeper of the women, and let them be given unguents. And the young woman who will be pleasing in the eyes of the king shall rule in Vashti's stead." And the thing was pleasing in the eyes of the king, and so he did. There was a Jew in Shushan in the capital, and his name was Mordecai. Woohoo! Son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, the Benjamite son, who had been exiled from Jerusalem with the group of exiles that was exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had exiled. And he became guardian to Hadassah, which is to say, Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. And the young woman was comely in features and comely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai had taken her as his daughter. And it happened when the king's word and his rule were heard, and many young women were gathered in Shushan, the capital by Haggai, that Esther was taken into the king's house by Haggai, keeper of the women. And the young woman was pleasing in his eyes, and she won favor before him. And he hastened to bring her unguents and her share of food to give to her, and the 7 young women who were fit to give her from the king's house. And he singled her out and her young women for good treatment in the women's house. Esther did not tell who were her people and her kin, for Mordecai had charged her not to tell. And every single day Mordecai would go walking in front of the women's court to know how Esther fared and what would be done for her. And when each young woman's turn came to come to the king at the conclusion of her having 12 months, according to the woman's rule, for thus would the days of the unguents be completed, 6 months in oil of myrrh, and 6 months of their unguents and 6 months in perfumes and women's unguents. In this fashion would be the young woman come to the king. Whatever she would say would be granted to her to take with her from the women's house to the house of the king. In the evening she would come in the morning, and she would go back to the women's house again in the hands of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, keeper of the concubines. She would not come again to the king unless the king desired her, and she was called by name. And when the turn came of Esther, daughter of Abihail, Mordecai's uncle, whom he had taken as his daughter, to come to the king, she asked nothing but what Haggai the king's eunuch would say. And Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus, to his royal house, in the 10th month, which is the month of Tevet, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor before him, more than all the virgins. And he put the royal crown on her head and made her queen in Vashti's stead. And the king made a great banquet for all his ministers and his servants, Esther's banquet, and he granted relief of taxes for the provinces, and he gave gifts in kingly fashion. And when the virgins gathered a second time with Mordecai sitting in the king's gate, Esther was not telling who were her kin and her people, as Mordecai had charged her. And Esther did what Mordecai said, for she was under his guardianship. And those days when Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate, Bigtha and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs of the guardians of the threshold, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the matter became known to Mordecai, and he told Esther, and Esther spoke out to the king in Mordecai's name. And the matter was searched out and found to be so, and the 2 of them were impaled on stakes. And it was written down on the book of Acts before the king. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3. After these things, King Ahasuerus elevated Haman. Oh man. I'm only going to do that once. Son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and raised him up and seated him higher than all the ministers who were with him. And the king's servants who were in the king's gate would kneel and bow down to Haman, for thus had the king charged concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel, would not bow down. And the king's servants who were in the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you flout the king's command?" And it happened as they said this to him day after day, and he did not heed them. They told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And Haman saw that Mordecai was not kneeling and not bowing down to him, and Haman brimmed with wrath. And he scorned to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who Mordecai's people were. And Haman sought to destroy all the Jews. Mordecai's people, who were all in Ahasuerus' kingdom. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus' reign, he cast a pur, which is a lot, for every day in the month and every month of the 12, and it fell on the month of Adar. And Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people, scattered and separate from the people in all the provinces of your kingdom, and their rules are different from every people's, and they do not observe the king's rules, and it does not pay for the king to leave them in peace. If it please the king, let it be written to wipe them out, and 10,000 talents of silver will I measure out to the court overseers to bring into the king's treasury. And the king removed his ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, foe of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the silver is yours, and the people's to do with as is good in your eyes. And the king's scribes were called together in the first month on its 13th day, and it was written as all that Haman had charged the king's satraps and the governors in every single province according to their mode of writing, and the ministers of every single people in every single province according to their language. In the name of King Ahasuerus was it written, and it was sealed with the king's ring. And missives were sent out by the hand of couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to wipe out all the Jews from the young lad to old man, babes and women, on a single day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, to take their spoils. A copy of the writing to be given as rule in every single province manifested to all peoples to be ready for this day. The couriers went out, rushed by the king's word, and the rule was given out in Shushan the capital. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, and the city of Shushan was confounded. I bet. That's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4. And Mordecai knew all that had been done. And Mordecai rent his garments, and donned sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city and cried out loudly and bitterly. And he came as far in as the king's gates, for one could not enter the king's gate in clothing of sackcloth. And in every single province where the king's word and his rule reached, the Jews were in great mourning, and fasting and weeping, and dirges and sackcloth and ashes were laid out for the multitudes. And Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was badly shaken. And she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and to remove his sackcloth from him, but he did not accept them. And Esther called to Hatach of the king's eunuchs, whom he had stationed before her, and she charged him concerning Mordecai to find out what was this, and for what for was this. And Hatach went out to Mordecai in the city square that was in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had befallen him, and the matter of the silver that Haman had meant to weigh out in the king's treasuries for the Jews to wipe them out, and the copy of the writing of the rule that was given out in Shushan to destroy them. And he gave him to show to Esther, to tell her, and to charge her to come to the king to plead with him and to entreat him for her people. And Hatach came to Mordecai's words to Esther. And Esther said to Hatach and charged him to convey to Mordecai, all the king's servants and the peoples of the king's province know that every man and woman who comes into the inner court without having been called, the single rule is to put to death unless the king reach out to him the golden scepter. As for me, I have not been called to come to the king in 30 days now. And they told Esther's words to Mordecai. And Mordecai said in response to Esther, do not imagine to escape of all the Jews in the house of the king. For if you indeed remain silent, relief and rescue will come to the Jews from elsewhere, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether, for just a time like this, you have attained royalty. And Esther said in response to Mordecai, go assemble all the Jews who are in Shushan, and fast on my behalf, and do not eat nor drink 3 days, night and day. And I too with my young women shall fast in this fashion. And so I shall come to the king not according to rule, and if I perish, I perish. And Mordecai moved on and did all that Esther had charged him. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. And it happened on the third day that Esther donned royal garb and stood in the inner court of the king's house, opposite the king's house, with the king sitting on his royal throne in the royal house, opposite to the entrance to the house. And it happened when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court that she found favor in his eyes. And he reached out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. And Esther approached and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What troubles you, Queen Esther? And what is your request?" "Up to half the kingdom, it will be granted to you." And Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him." And the king said, "Hurry to Haman and do Esther's bidding." And the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And the king said to Esther at the wine banquet, "What is your petition? And it will be granted to you. And what is your request?" "Up to half the kingdom, and it will be done." And Queen Esther answered and said, "My petition and my request, if I have found favor in the eyes of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition, that I shall prepare for them, and tomorrow I shall do according to the king's bidding." And Haman went out that day happy and of good cheer. And when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and he had not arisen and not stirred for him, Haman brimmed with wrath against Mordecai. And Haman held himself in check, and came to his house, and sent back his friends, and Zeresh his wife. And Haman recounted to them the glory of his wealth, and his many sons, and all in which the king had elevated him, and how he had raised him up over the noblemen, over the servants of the king. And Haman said, "Queen Esther brought with the king to the banquet, and she prepared only me, and tomorrow too I am invited by her with the king. But all this is not worth my while, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate." And Zeresh his wife, together with all his friends, said to him, "Let them set up a stake 50 cubits high, and in the morning said to the king that Mordecai be impaled on it, and come with the king to the banquet happy." And the thing pleased Haman, and he set up the stake. We move now to chapter 6. That night, the king could not sleep, and he ordered to bring the annals and the book of Acts, that they be read to the king. And he found out it was written that Mordecai had told about Bigtha and Teresh, and 2 eunuchs of the king, and the guardians of the threshold, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor and grandeur were done for Mordecai on account of this?" And the king's lads, his attendants, said, "Nothing was done for him." And the king said, "Who is in the court?" And Haman had come to the outer court in the king's house to say to the king to impale Mordecai on the stake that he had readied for him. And the king's lad said to him, "Look, Haman is standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." And Haman came, and the king said to him, "What should be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" And Haman said in his heart, "To whom would the king desire to do honor more than to me?" And Haman said to the king, "The man whom the king desires to honor, let them bring royal raiment that the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, and set a royal crown on his head, and give the raiment and his horse into the hands of a man of the king's nobles, the courtiers, and let them dress the man whom the king desires to honor, and ride him on the horse through the city square, and call out before him, 'Thus shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor.'" And the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the raiment and the horse as you have spoken, and do this for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting in the king's gate. Omit nothing from all you have spoken." And Haman took the raiment and the horse, and dressed Mordecai, and rode him on the horse throughout the city square, and called out before him, "Thus shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor." And Mordecai returned to the king's gate, and Haman was thrust back into his house, mournful and distraught. And Haman recounted to Zeresh his wife, to all his friends, what had befallen him. And his wise men and Zeresh his wife said to him, "If Mordecai is of the seed of the Jews before whom you have begun to fall, you shall not prevail over him. and you shall surely fall before him." While they were still speaking, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet that Esther had prepared. Chapter 7. And the king and Haman came to drink with Esther. And the king said to Esther again on the second day of the wine banquet, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? And it will be granted to you, up to half the kingdom, and it will be done." And Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in the eyes of the king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me in my petition and my people's in my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be wiped out. And we have been sold to be male slaves and slave girls. I would have remained silent, for the foe is not worth bothering the king." And King Ahasuerus said, and he said to Queen Esther, "Who is it, and where is he, whose heart has prompted him to do this?" And Esther said, "A man, foe, and enemy, this evil Haman." And Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine banquet to the pavilion garden. And Haman stood to please for his life to Queen Esther. And he saw that the evil was fixed against him by the king. And the king came back from the pavilion garden to the house of the wine banquet. And Haman was fallen on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, "Is it also to force the queen with me in the house?" The word had scarcely issued from the king's mouth, and Haman's face turned pale. And Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said before the king, "Look, there is actually a steak that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king, standing in Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Impale him on it." And they impaled Haman on the stake that he had readied for Mordecai, and the king's wrath subsided. Chapter 8. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther in the house of Haman, the foe of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king removed his ring that he had taken away from Haman and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther placed Mordecai over the house of Haman. And Esther spoke once again before the king and fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to take away the evil Haman the Agagite and his scheme that he had hatched against the Jews. And the king reached out his golden scepter to Esther. And Esther arose and stood before the king. And she said, "If it please the king, and if I have found favor before him, and if the thing be fit before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to turn back the missives, the scheme of Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in the king's provinces. For how could I behold the evil that would befall my people, and how could I behold the destruction of my birth kin?" And King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Look, I have given the house of Haman to Esther, and they have impaled him on a stake for having laid hands on the Jews. And as for you, write concerning the Jews what is good in your eyes and in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring. For a writ that has been written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring, one cannot turn back." And the king's scribes were called together at that time in the 3rd month, which is in the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day therein. And it was written as all that Mordecai had charged to the Jews and to the satraps and the governors and the ministers of the provinces, from India to Cush, 127 provinces, every province according to his own mode of writing, and every people according to its language. And to the Jews according to their system of writing, and according to their language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's ring, and sent missives by the hand of couriers on horseback, riding male horses bred of swift steeds, that the king has granted to the Jews who are in every single city to assemble and defend their lives, to destroy and to kill and to wipe out the whole force of every people and province that was assaulting them, even children and women, and to take their booty on single day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. The copy of the writ to be given as a rule in every single province, manifest to all the peoples, and for the Jews to be ready for this day to take vengeance on their enemies. The couriers, riding the male horses, went out rushing urgently by the king's command. and the rule was given out in Shushan the capital. And Mordecai came out before the king in royal garb, indigo and white, in great golden diadem and a wrap of crimson linen. And the city of Shushan was merry and rejoicing, for the Jews there was light and joy and gladness and honor. In every single province, in every single city, where the king's command and his rule reached, there was joy and gladness for the Jews, banquet and holiday, and many of the peoples of the land were passing as Jews, for the fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. Chapter 9. On the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day therein, when the king's command and his rule came to be enacted, on the day when his enemies of the Jews hoped to dominate them, and on the contrary, it was the Jews who dominated their foes, the Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought to do them harm, and no man could stand before them, for the fear of them had fallen on all of the peoples. And all the ministers of all the provinces, and the satraps and the governors, and those who carried out the king's task, were raising up the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. For great was Mordecai in the house of the king, and his fame was going about through all the provinces, for the man Mordecai was becoming ever greater. And the Jews struck down all their enemies with a blow of the sword, and with killing and destruction. And they did to their enemies what they willed. And in Shushan the capital, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. And Parshadantha and Dalphon and Aspatha and Paratha and Adalia and Aridatha and Pashmata and Arisai and Aridai and Vaizatha and 10 sons of Haman, son of Hamadatha, foe of the Jews, did they kill. But they did not lay hands on the spoil. On that day, the number of the slain in Shushan and the capital came before the king, and the king said to Queen Esther, in Shushan the capital, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman. And in the rest of the king's provinces, what have they done? And what is your petition? It will be granted to you. And what more is your request? And it will be done. And Esther said, if it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan tomorrow, as well as to do accordingly to today's rule. And let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on stakes. And the king spoke to have it done thus, and to have a rule given out in Shushan to impale Haman's 10 sons. And the Jews who were in Shushan assembled as well on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and killed 300 men in Shushan, for they did not lay hands on the spoils. And the rest of the Jews who were in the king provinces assembled and defended their lives and had respite from their enemies and killed their foes, 75,000, but they did not lay hands on the spoils. On the 13th day of the month of Adar, with respite on the 14th day therein, they made it a day of banqueting and rejoicing. And the Jews who were in Shushan assembled on the 13th day therein and on the 14th day therein, with respite on the 15th day therein. And they made it a day of banqueting and rejoicing. Therefore, do the village Jews who dwell in unwalled towns make the 14th day of the month of Adar rejoicing and banqueting and holiday and sending of portions of food to each other. And Mordecai wrote down these things and sent missives to all the Jews who were in the provinces of King Ahasuerus, near and far, to fix for them they should make the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th day therein every single year, like the days when the Jews had respite from their enemies. And the month that was turned for them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning to holiday, to make them days of banqueting and rejoicing, and sending of portions of food to each other, and other gifts to the poor, and for the Jews to accept all that they had begun to do and that Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hamadatha, the Agagite foe of the Jews, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast a pur, which is a lot, to panic and destroy them. And when she came before the king, he said with the missive, let the evil schemes that he hatched against the Jews turn back on his own head. And they impaled him and his sons on stakes. Therefore have they called these days Purim, by the name Pur. Therefore, by all the words of this epistle, and what the king had seen concerning this, and what had come upon them, the Jews fixed and accepted for themselves, for their seed, and for all who joined with them, never to be violated, to make these 2 days, as they were written and according to their time in every single year, that these days should be remembered and done in every generation, clan by clan, province by province, city by city, and that these days of Purim should not pass away from the midst of the Jews, and their remembrance should not come to an end from among their seed. And Queen Esther, daughter of Abiel, and with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this Purim epistle once more. And missives were sent to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, words of peace and truth, to fix these days of Purim in their time, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had fixed for them. And they had fixed for themselves and for their seed, just as they had fixed for themselves matters of fasts and their supplication. And Esther's dictum fixed these matters of Purim, and it was written out in a missive. We end with chapter 10. And King Ahasuerus imposed forced labor on all the land and on all the coastlands, and all the acts of his authority and his might on the account of Mordecai's greatness, to which the king raised him. Are they not written in the book of Acts of the king of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and great over the Jews, in favor with his many brothers, seeking the good of his people and speaking peace for all its seed. The end. So I hope while we were reading, you saw a lot of those reversals, those misunderstandings, the certainly outlandish partying, and a couple other funny things. So by listening to this, you have fulfilled the mitzvah of hearing the Megillah read, and I hope that it was enjoyable for you. I'm wishing you all a very happy Purim and month of Adar. And we do apologize we won't see you tonight for Rock Shabbat. Unfortunately, it has been canceled. But we hope that you enjoy your Purim week in this month of Adar, which we are meant to celebrate in your own homes, in your own way. Wishing you well from Temple Israel, Rabbi Mike signing off. Chag Purim Sameach.